This is Bob Oliphant from the Westford Historical Society and Museum, bringing you episode 20 of Session 4 of the Westford Wardsman podcast. The Westford Wardsman newspaper was part of Turner's Public Spirit, a weekly newspaper in Ayer a century ago. In this episode, we'll be reading the Wardsman for the week ending Saturday, May 20th, 1911, and I'll elaborate on what was happening in Westford that week. The week starts with the Westford Center section. Mrs. Andrew Wright has returned to her Westford home for the summer, and her niece, Mrs. Thornton Lewis, is staying with her. Mr. and Mrs. John Wright and family, who have been occupying Mrs. Wright's house, have moved to the picturesque log cabin on Prospect Hill. Mrs. Mary E. Mitchell of Cambridge, who has had so serious a time with a broken ankle for many weeks, has recovered sufficiently to get about on crutches. Mrs. Metcalf is Mrs. Homer M. Seavey's mother and has many interesting friends here. The Seaveys lived in the house that was once located about where the driveway to the library is located now, I believe. Mrs. Joseph Knight entertained the teachers at her home last Thursday with a supper party followed by a pleasant social evening. Those present were Mrs. Norris, Lawrence, Fisher, Burnham, Grant, and Crocker, also the teacher from the Parkerville School. I guess we didn't know her name. Mr. Lindley, who has been foreman of the Brigham farm, removed his goods and family last week. The household goods were taken over the road in a very large auto truck. The new man who assumed charge at the farm is a Mr. Green, who has been at work for the past 2 weeks. Mrs. G.W. Tarleton and little son from Ohio are visiting at the Congregational Parsonage. Mrs. Tarleton and Mrs. Wallace are sisters. Miss Grace Lumbert is in Lowell, Miss Mary Moran in Littleton, and Mrs. Alice Lambert in Graniteville, all busy with their helpful mission as nurses. Mrs. Ida Gould and Mrs. Daisy Colburn have been spending a few days this week at South Framingham and Boston. Miss Lucy Raddin, R-A-D-D-I-N, one of our former popular teachers, spends this weekend with her old friends, Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Knight. One of the trying features of the prolonged drought is the effect on the extensive and valuable shrubbery and young trees that have been placed in the park. I'm sure this is a reference to what we call Whitney Playground now, and which no amount of artificial wetting can take the place of the good rains so much needed. Mr. and Mrs. Walter Wright, Mrs. Elizabeth Whitney, and Miss Emily Fletcher enjoyed calling on Roy Wheeler, formerly of Westford, while in Denver on their recent Western trip. You may recall that Roy Wheeler is a brother of Westford's tax collector, Leonard Wheeler. The sons of veterans and daughters of veterans met at the Cavalry Association building, that's now the house at 20 Boston Road, on Monday evening and made further arrangements for Memorial Day, full notice of plans of which will appear next week. Miss Edith Lawrence of the Academy Teachers has been enjoying a visit from her mother, Mrs. G.C. Lawrence of Campello, this week. Mrs. Lawrence was a guest at the Tadmont Club on Tuesday evening. Mrs. Alec McDougall is at the Lowell General Hospital, where she underwent an operation for appendicitis on Thursday of this week. Miss Emily F. Fletcher, who returned recently from an extensive Western trip, has placed in the library an illustrated copy of an illustrated book of San Diego, California, issued by the San Diego Fire Department. This is of interest from the fact that George Harrison is the president of the Board of Fire Commissioners of that place, and a fine picture of him is in the book. Mr. Harrison was a Westford boy who went west when young and has made good. He visited his hometown last summer and took great interest in our beautiful library and many improvements. Mrs. Charles Hinton of Philadelphia, who has been spending a 2 weeks vacation with her sister, Mrs. Ralph Bridgeford, left town last Saturday to join her husband in Cohoes, New York. Warren Karkin has been appointed Inspector of Faucets and Pipes by the directors of the Westford Water Company and will visit every water taker in town. I'm guessing they had trouble with water leakage. The new officers for Westford Athletic Association for this season are Alfred W. Hartford, manager, Edward Hamlin, assistant manager. The season will start on Memorial Day and extend to September 15th. The inscription has been placed on the boulder at Whitney Park this week. The lettering is cut into the rock and follows the circular outline of the top of the boulder. The inscription is significant in its simplicity and reads, Whitney Playground, 1910. The next paragraph is titled Borough Here. A rather unusual little visitor arrived at Westford Station one day last week. This was a little western borough who had been sent all the way from Manitou, Colorado, by Mr. and Mrs. Walter Wright, which they acquired during their recent trip. Word was sent when he got to Ayer that he had got as far as that and had kicked his crate to pieces en route. This was repaired, and he was transferred to the Stony Brook train for the last lap of the journey, and no doubt this little Rocky Mountain canary was just as tired and homesick as many a human traveler after a long trip. He is now getting rested and acclimated at the Whitney summer home. An unfortunate and amusing circumstance is the decided dislike horses seem to have for him, and the caretaker sees to it that they are kept a safe distance apart. The next section is the Tadmuck Club section. The last event in the Tadmuck calendar was the final social, which took place on Tuesday evening at the Unitarian Parlors. This was a guest night, and as most of the members who could invited their husbands, it was rather gentlemen's night. There were about 125 present, the beautiful spring evening making it easy for all to come. The rooms were prettily and simply decorated with spring flowers. Miss Sarah W. Loker, the president of the Tadmuck Club, presided, and a concert program was given by Mrs. Gertrude and Julia Fletcher with their fine quality Victor machine. This is probably an RCA Victor gramophone or Victrola. And Miss Leah Demerit of Lowell entertained with a group of readings. After the program, ice cream and cake was served and a social hour enjoyed. The efficient committee in charge were Mrs. Edward Fisher, Mrs. Herbert Hildreth, Mrs. J. Herbert Fletcher, Mr. Samuel L. Taylor, and Mr. Charles L. Hildreth. The next paragraph is called Tennis. The new tennis courts at the Whitney Park is making its object of beautiful recreation and enjoyment very evident these pleasant days. Every afternoon finds a group of players, and some pretty skillful games and some of more amateur fashion are engaged in. A pretty addition to the Frost School building is 7 flourishing window boxes attached along the southerly side. It is an interesting sight to see the children of the schools practicing for the dedicatory festival, which will take place on Saturday, May 27th. Or if this day should prove very stormy, the plans will be carried out on Monday following, May 29th. This will be better than postponing 1 week, provided postponement is necessary, for many are expected in town for the occasion. This is to be an event of much interest. There will be sports in the morning, tennis, baseball, etc., and the dedicatory celebration in the afternoon, with many interesting features. A cordial welcome is extended to all interested parents and friends to be present. Next is a paragraph of a listing of new books in the library. It lists 12 books. I won't mention them all, but several are of interest. One is Fanny Farmer's Boston Cooking School Cookbook, Helen Keller's World I Live In, and a book by J.H. Robinson on poultry craft. That was probably of interest to a number of people in Westford who raised their own chickens at that time, as some still do. The next section is the About Town section. The Peach Order of Eben Prescott on Francis Hill Peach Orchard of Eben Prescott on Francis Hill has made affidavit that it will pay its debts this summer, which probably means it is in full blossom. The Academy High School will give a dance on Friday evening, May 26th, for the benefit of a good time. The Colonial Orchestra of Lowell will furnish the music for the hoppers to hop by. Someone has committed assault and battery on the Stone Arch Bridge on the Stony Brook Road and thrown some of the stone curbing into the brook, and they have sunk to the bottom. All of the stone and part of the lumber is on the ground for the new house for Edward B. Whitney on the Lowell Road, west of Brookside Corner. The next meeting of the Fortnightly Club is due next Friday evening. The programs are always taking, so come and be taken. Pantry thieves, as well as milk thieves, are carrying on a business of midnight help yourself. For a bill of particulars for the Pantry Dare and Do affair, inquire along the easterly terminal of Main Street from Fairview on. They left no trace of their race. The fire last week, Thursday, was in the timberlands of Texas, the prairie region of Westford, near the boundary town lines of Acton, Littleton, Carlisle, and Westford. The fire started about noon, and although Acton and Westford responded with liberal help, it was not subdued until morning. It is supposed to have started from an engine on the Nashua and Acton Railroad, what we call the Red Line today, which is no longer there, actually. The continued drought and continued fires have led the selectmen to apply the emergency brake, forbidding any fires being set in the open. The next paragraph is called First Dance. The members of Stony Brook Circle, West Chelmsford, held their first dance last week Friday evening at Marshall's Hall, Westford Corner. Lowell, North Chelmsford, Brookside, Westford, Graniteville, Forge Village, Littleton, and the surrounding towns were right there in the hall when Gilmore's Orchestra of Lowell prevented anything like cold feet. For management, first, Miss Catherine Dunn, spelled D-U-N-N, who was not outdone, D-O-N-E. Second, Miss Eva Carlson, floor patrol. Miss Bertha Colburn, assistant. Assistant Mrs. Mary Flynn, Chief of Staff with rank of Private, Miss Esther Johnson. This management kept everybody on the whirl-twirl of a stirring good time. This is the first of more to come. The next section is the Forge Village section. Percy Wilson, who has been out ill for a week, has now resumed work again. Fred Toussaint has been suffering for the past 2 weeks with a lacerated hand. Miss Emily Catchpole and her sister, Mrs. Joseph Mason of Lowell, spent Sunday visiting Mr. and Mrs. William Blodgett of Groton. Mr. and Mrs. John E. Burnett and Miss Della Drake spent the weekend as guests of Mr. and Mrs. Chester Blodgett of Groton. Mrs. Joseph Mason and children of Lowell are visiting with her father, Henry Catchpole. A family reunion was held at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Fenimore Morton. Among the out-of-town guests present were Mr. and Mrs. John Morton and Mr. Northrop of Lowell, Mr. and Mrs. William French of Nashua, New Hampshire, Miss Hattie Northrop of Pepperell, Mrs. Estabrook of Lowell, and Miss Vaughn of North Billerica. The merry party broke up at a late hour with the hope that another pleasant reunion will be held in the near future. The Ladies' Sewing Circle met in Recreation Hall on Wednesday afternoon. The annual church fair of St. Andrew's Mission will be held in Recreation Hall on Saturday afternoon and evening, May 20th. The Ladies' Sewing Circle and Girls' Friendly Society are busy getting their tables ready. Fruit, candy, groceries, flowers, aprons, and also plain and fancy sewing articles will be displayed for sale, together with the well-known grab table. It is hoped that a large number will take advantage of the fair, which promises to be well worth attending. Mrs. Miles Collins has returned from the Lowell General Hospital, where she underwent a most successful operation 3 weeks ago. Bernard Smith is visiting with relatives in Manchester, New Hampshire. The next paragraph is called the IOOFMU. This is the Oddfellows Lodge. Loyal Self-Help Lodge of the Oddfellows held its regular meeting last Monday night. Nomination of officers for the coming term took place, which resulted as follows. Officers elected were Fred Davis, Charles Flanagan, Percy Wilson, William Baker, John Burnett, William Burnett, and William D. Rohn. The first Sunday in June has been set apart as Memorial Sunday, and services will be held in St. Andrew's Mission. All members and friends are earnestly invited to attend. At the conclusion of the meeting, Dr. Cyril A. Blaney, the lodge physician, who was married recently, was presented with a solid brass mantel clock, Roman finish, Francis Lowther making the presentation speech in behalf of the order. Although taken completely by surprise, Dr. Blaney responded in his usual sincere and heartfelt manner and extended his thanks to the lodge generously. The next section is the Graniteville section. The Graniteville baseball team met with the Pawtucket Blues on the home grounds here last Saturday and defeated them by the score of 11-5. Dick Spenner, Gaudette, and Stanley batted well for the home team, while Jack Spenner brought the crowd to its feet when he lined one for a timely three-bagger. Jack and Dick Spenner did the battery work for the home team, while Van Zant and Gaiman were in the points for the Pawtucket Blues. At the 9 o'clock Mass celebrated in Healy's Hall on Sunday morning, Reverend M.E. Doherty preached an elegant sermon on the teachings of the Catholic Church. His remarks were followed with deep interest by the large congregation present. Mrs. Charles Eaton, a former resident here, but now located in Canada, has been renewing old acquaintances in the village, where she has been the guest of Mr. and Mrs. Welsh. Those who took part in the Old Folks concert at the M.E. Church on last Friday evening are receiving the warm congratulations from their many friends on their success, and there is some talk of having the concert repeated in some of the nearby towns in the near future. This was sometimes done in Westford and surrounding towns. If there was a particular good program that was put on by a local church, it would kind of go on tour and rerun their program in other churches in other towns. Miss Angela Matron and Miss Stella Shattuck are now visiting in Boston for a few days. Edward Defoe is attending the convention of the Foresters of America, which is being held at Holyoke. Miss Florence Sullivan, clerk at Henry Healy's store, is also attending the convention. Miss Fanny McCarty has been elected a delegate to the MCOF, that's the Massachusetts Catholic Order of Foresters Convention, which will be held in Worcester on Wednesday, May 24th. And that's the news in Westford for the week ending May 20th, 1911. Thank you for listening, and thanks to Ryan Cousins of WestfordCAT for providing technical support. You can find transcriptions and podcasts from the Wardsman at our website at museum.westford.org or visit the Historical Society's Facebook page for more Westford news from days gone by. This is Bob Oliphant, and I hope you will join us for next week's Westford Wardsman podcast. Thank you.